right, how about that whistle-stop tour through the philosophy of science? We begin with Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte is known as the founder of sociology, the founder of philosophy of science, and the founder of positivism. So a very important figure in the history of ideas. Comte thought that science could provide us with positive knowledge, and by positive knowledge he meant certain or reliable knowledge. So we don't really talk about positivism anymore, but we retain the sense of positive that he intended when we say, "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm positive." So the key claim that Comte made was that we should adhere to a method rather than doctrine, and in that way we will liberate ourselves from the shackles of superstition. So Comte was a figure very much in the vein of Descartes and Francis Bacon, who said that the key to scientific progress was to follow a method that would reliably produce true beliefs. Comte also argued that all knowledge was ultimately founded on observation, so he was an important figure in the empiricist tradition. He argued that real knowledge, what we really want, is out there in the phenomena. We need to observe the phenomena that actually appear to us and not try to reach behind it to posit things that exist beyond the space of appearances. So the idea was, let's just look at nature, observe its regularities, and describe them, and don't go beyond that and posit some kind of underlying true essences that exist outside the space of phenomena. So Comte was a fallibilist. That meant that Comte thought that knowledge was something that didn't need to be absolutely certain. So a fallibilist is someone who says, I know that P, where P is some proposition, I know that P, but there's an insignificant chance that not P. So the fallibilist is comfortable with that. An epistemic purist, someone who thinks that knowledge should be absolutely certain, would not be at home with Comte's philosophy. Comte thought knowledge was probabilistic, and that was good enough. So knowledge doesn't require absolute certainty. And Comte also, importantly, insisted on reflexive practice in science. He said, we can't just observe nature, we need to observe our own observation. So he was one of these important early figures who recognized that when we observe the world, especially the world of social phenomena, we impact the world. And so we have to be reflexive in all scientific practice, observe not only the world, but observe ourselves, observing the world so we can know what kind of impact we're having on our understanding of the world, and the world itself, for that matter. Another one of Comte's key insights was this idea that science is reliable not by virtue of the character of its practitioner, but by virtue of the nature of its practices. So you see the sociological dimension of Comte's thought here. He would not think that it would be appropriate in epistemology to focus just on the character of practitioners. Rather, you have to take this sort of social perspective on science and think about the practices that it uses. That's the real key to the advance of knowledge for someone like Comte. Now, developing this vein of positivism, we have the Vienna Circle. Now, I can't talk much about the Vienna Circle here. They were a very important group of philosophers. They were instrumental in creating what we now know as analytic philosophy. I'm just going to say a few things about them. One, they often referred to the position that they sort of collectively developed as logical positivism or logical empiricism. And part of that approach was the doctrine of verificationism. So this is the idea that a statement about the world, a statement about matters of fact, could only be considered meaningful if it can be verified by reference to observation. So if you're saying anything about the way the world is, that statement is only meaningful if it's a statement that can be verified by reference to observation. So you have to be able to take that statement out into the world and test it against the kind of tribunal of your sense experience. If you can't do that, then it might be an analytically true statement, a statement that's true by definition. For example, all bachelors are unmarried men. That's just something that's true by definition. You don't need to meet a bachelor to know that that's the case. But if it's a statement about the world and it can't be cashed out in terms of observation, then it's a meaningless statement. So science, understood in terms of verificationism, is the practice of formulating meaningful statements and using observation to judge whether such a statement is correct. And knowledge on this view is, again, essentially probabilistic. It's a matter of degrees of belief, not a matter of certainty. And the problem that this view faced, among many, but one of the most significant problems that this sort of approach faced, were these sort of never-ending debates about whether an observation can ever confirm a theory. And this is a debate that sort of, as you will see, it kind of goes throughout the history of philosophy of science. For obvious reasons, people are trying to figure out, how can you prove that a theory is true? How can we know that we have scientific knowledge? Well, it seems like we need to have some way of confirming it, and observation seems like an obvious way to do that. But the problem is, when your knowledge is probabilistic, you're always proceeding by induction. So if I see 10,000 swans and they're all white, I might generate the scientific statement, all swans are white. But, as we all know, it's possible to encounter a black swan, which would disconfirm my theory that all swans are white. So if all of my knowledge is probabilistic like that, if I'm just building it up through observation, when do I ever have enough observations to confirm my theory? It doesn't seem like such a thing is possible. So Karl Popper was another very important philosopher of science who was exercised by this issue, the fact that it doesn't seem possible for an observation to ever confirm a theory. And so he kind of turned the idea on its head, and he said, the aim of science is not to prove scientific theories, but rather to disprove them. Scientific statement is not one that you can verify, but rather one that you can falsify. That's what science is about. Induction can't be the method of science because of the black swan problem. There's no logical necessity if you proceed just by induction, if you're just building up your beliefs on the basis of observation. So, what you need instead is a logic of refutation, because the black swan proves the falsity of the white swan theory. So this, Popper said, this gives us a way to think about science in a productive way. We should think of science as a kind of two-part process. First, you formulate conjectures or hypotheses, and then you go out into the world and you do your best to falsify them. You try to find observations that will refute your theories. That is what the scientist does. The scientist is this kind of critical thinker who comes up with conjectures and then does his or her utmost to disprove those conjectures. But this ran into a kind of skepticism, the very kind of skepticism that Karl Popper hated. Why take scientific theories seriously if they only exist in order to be falsified? Why should we take scientific theories seriously if these theories are just things that are waiting to be falsified by experience? So in response to this worry and the kind of skepticism that follows from it, Popper ended up dropping this strict falsificationism that he had developed, and he said, well, theories can be corroborated. They're corroborated in the sense that if they pass severe tests, we can call them knowledge. But then the skepticism, of course, reemerges, and you have to ask, how do we know when the test is severe enough? How do we know when it's passed enough severe tests in order for us to call it knowledge? So there's this kind of irony in Popper that you also see in Descartes. Descartes is another figure who said, let's use methodological skepticism. We'll use the most extreme skepticism we can possibly come up with to test our views, and anything that makes it through the crucible of that skepticism, we can call it knowledge. And it was, it was an amazing project that he engaged in the Meditations. But the major legacy of Descartes' work is a kind of skepticism. He came up with the argument from dreaming and the evil genius argument. And these arguments had, in some sense, as much influence, at least as much influence on the history of skepticism as they did on the history of epistemology.